There was something magical about Grandpa Philippe's kitchen, the scent of wood polish mixed with the faint sweetness of sugar, and on the highest shelf sat the legendary glass jar, a kaleidoscope of colors swirling under the morning light. Inside, lollipops gleamed like captured rainbows. Philippe, a retired craftsman with hands that once built clocks and toys, liked keeping them there, a splash of childhood tucked inside his quiet days. To him, that jar wasn't just candy. It was a reminder that small joys could brighten even the slowest afternoons. Then there was Romeo, his 8-year-old whirlwind of curiosity. Every visit turned the house into a playground of giggles, footprints, and secrets. He'd sneak around with the stealth of a cartoon spy, eyes darting to the shelf, plotting the perfect candy heist. Sometimes, Felipe caught a glimpse, a tiny hand stretching up, tiptoes wobbling, determination shining through mischief. And every time the old man would just smile, pretending not to see, letting the game play out. It was their unspoken dance, the hunter and the thief, both pretending to lose. Their days flowed with a rhythm only family can create. Morning walks through the garden, shared lunches filled with laughter, and soft, sleepy evenings by the radio. Philippe told stories from his younger years, while Romeo, barely listening, toyed with his candy sticks, lost in his own world of sugar dreams. There was peace in that routine, the kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket. Neither of them knew, of course, that soon, a simple jar of lollipops would become a doorway to something deeper, a lesson that would linger long after the sweetness had faded. Every morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, striking that glass jar like a stage spotlight. The colors came alive, ruby reds, lemon yellows, ocean blues, all glowing as if inviting Romeo closer. He'd linger by the table, pretending to tie his shoe or play with a toy, but his gaze always drifted upward. You could almost hear the thoughts running wild in his head. Just one more. Grandpa won't even notice. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. Felipe always noticed, but he never said a word. There was something tender about the way he let Romeo get away with it. Maybe it reminded him of when he was a boy, sneaking pastries from his mother's windowsill, his pockets filled with crumbs and guilt. Watching Romeo felt like watching time fold over itself, a mirror of the mischief he once carried in his own smile. So, instead of scolding, he'd play along. He'd whistle loudly from the hallway, giving the boy just enough warning to drop the evidence and run. They both enjoyed the act, one pretending to steal, the other pretending not to see. And in those little moments, something beautiful was happening between them. Not the obvious kind of love, not hugs or declarations, but the quiet, everyday kind that grows between trust and laughter. The lollipop jar was more than temptation. It was a bond. It gave them a reason to tease, to connect, to share something unspoken. Yet beneath that sweetness, a small thought began to stir in Philippe's heart, a whisper of curiosity about what this game was really teaching the boy. One evening, as the cicadas hummed outside and the last rays of sunlight painted gold across the table, Philippe found himself watching Romo from the doorway. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully unwrapping a stolen lollipop, eyes glowing with victory. There was something almost sacred in that little ritual, the anticipation, the first taste, the sparkle of joy that followed. It made Felipe smile, though beneath that smile, a question quietly formed. What happens when the sweetness fades? Later that night, after Romeo had fallen asleep, Felipe walked into the kitchen and looked at the jar again. Half the candies were gone, but he didn't mind. What caught his attention were the fingerprints on the glass, tiny smudges like memories pressed in sugar dust. He ran a finger along the smooth curve of the jar, feeling both amused and oddly sentimental. It wasn't about the missing candy anymore. It was about watching a child discover the world, one secret at a time. As the house fell silent, Felipe turned off the light and stood for a moment in the glow of the moonlit window. The jar shimmered softly, like a small constellation on his shelf. He didn't know it yet, but soon those innocent fingerprints would tell a different story, one not just about sweetness and mischief, but about lessons that linger long after childhood fades. Days rolled on, and Grandpa Philippe began to notice a pattern. The once perfect lollipops in his jar were now turning into small, sad relics, half-eaten sticks tossed near the flower pots, wrappers stuck under the table, sugary smears glistening in the sunlight. It wasn't hard to figure out who the culprit was. Romeo's sticky fingerprints were practically a signature, but what truly caught Felipe's attention wasn't the mess. It was the mystery of why the boy never finished them. At first it made him chuckle. Maybe Romeo's curiosity burned hotter than his patience. Maybe the thrill was in the stealing, not the savoring. But the more he thought about it, the more it nagged at him. The unfinished candies began to feel symbolic. Tiny testaments to how quickly delight can fade once the novelty wears off. Each one seemed to whisper a quiet truth. Beginnings are easy. Finishing is what tests the heart. So, one afternoon, as he sat by the window carving a small wooden bird, Felipe's thoughts drifted deeper. He wondered what lessons childhood should teach, not through lectures or punishment, but through experience. His gaze fell to the jar again, now a little emptier, and he smiled softly to himself. Maybe, he thought, it's time I help him learn what it means to see something through. The idea felt gentle, almost playful, but beneath it, something profound was starting to take shape. The next morning, the garden shimmered under the dew, and as Felipe watered his plants, his eyes caught sight of another candy stick buried in the soil, half-sucked, still clinging to a hint of color. He sighed, not out of anger, but out of something softer. "You little rascal," he murmured, half laughing to himself. It wasn't about waste or disobedience anymore. It was about the meaning behind the act. Romeo loved the start, that first sweet rush, but once the pleasure dulled, he simply let it go. How familiar that felt, even to Felipe himself. He remembered his own half-finished things, projects left in drawers, dreams he had once chased but set aside when life grew busy or complicated. Maybe Romeo wasn't just a boy being careless. Maybe he was unknowingly mirroring something much deeper about how people handled joy, effort, and patience. Felipe leaned on his rake, letting the thought linger. Life had a way of teaching through repetition, and this time, the teacher might just be an 8-year-old with a sweet tooth. That afternoon, Felipe watched Romeo play in the yard, running barefoot, his laughter ringing through the air like music. He loved that sound, wild and pure, but he also saw how quickly it faded when the boy got bored or distracted. It was in those fleeting bursts of energy, those abrupt stops, that Felipe found the reflection of every grown-up heart, eager to begin, reluctant to persist. He smiled, realizing the lollipops weren't just candy anymore. They were a mirror, and maybe it was time to let the mirror teach. That evening, as the kitchen filled with the scent of warm bread and chamomile tea, Felipe sat at the table, lost in thought. The jar of lollipops gleamed faintly under the yellow light, beautiful, but somehow incomplete, like a melody missing its final note. He watched Romeo dart in and out of the room, giggling, leaving trails of color and noise wherever he went. The boy was full of beginnings, bursts of energy, unfinished songs, half-built forts, and Felipe couldn't help but wonder when he'd learn to stay until the end. He didn't want to scold him. That was never Felipe's way. Lessons, he believed, should grow like seeds, quietly, patiently, until they bloomed on their own. So he began to think of how to make Romeo feel what it meant to finish something, not just hear about it. A gentle test, maybe. Something small, yet meaningful enough to stick. His gaze returned to the candy jar, and a smile crept across his face, the kind that only grandfathers wear when an idea takes root in both wisdom and love. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of sugar and soil. The night felt peaceful, but in that calm, something was shifting. The next time Romeo reached for a lollipop, things wouldn't unfold the same way. Felipe's quiet plan was forming, not to punish, but to teach. And in his heart, he knew it would be one of those simple moments that last a lifetime. It was one of those quiet afternoons when even the walls seemed to nap. The sun poured through the lace curtains, painting soft patterns across the kitchen floor. Felipe sat in his armchair, pretending to read the newspaper. Though his eyes weren't on the words, they were on the candy jar. He'd placed it deliberately low this time, within tempting reach, a silent invitation. Somewhere in the house, he could hear the telltale rhythm of small footsteps, light, cautious, full of purpose. Romeo thought he was invisible. He peeked around corners, tiptoed across the tiles, and froze at every sound. His heart thudded like a tiny drum as he crept closer to the jar, eyes wide with desire and mischief. The candy shimmered inside, irresistible and waiting. Just one, he told himself, just one, and Grandpa won't even notice. With a quick glance over his shoulder, he stretched his hand toward the glass lid, the thrill of rebellion pulsing through him. But before his fingers could touch the jar, a voice, calm but deep, filled the room. "Enjoying your little adventure, are we?" Romeo froze, his hand suspended mid-air, his stomach dropping. He turned slowly, cheeks flushed, to see Grandpa Philippe standing in the doorway, arms crossed but smiling. For a long second, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with both guilt and amusement, the kind only a child and grandparent could share. Romeo's eyes darted to the floor, then back to his grandfather, trying to gauge how much trouble he was in. His lips trembled, words fumbling somewhere between apology and excuse. "I was just looking," he muttered, clutching the edge of his shirt like it could shield him from the truth. Felipe raised an eyebrow, his voice soft but playful. "Looking? With your hand inside the jar?" The boy froze again, realizing he'd been caught fair and square. For a heartbeat, he looked like he might cry, until he saw the glint of mischief in Philippe's smile. Instead of scolding him, the old man stepped forward and crouched down so they were eye to eye. "You love lollipops that much, huh?" he asked gently. Romeo nodded, barely whispering a yes. Felipe reached for the jar, lifted the lid and handed one to the boy. "Then today," he said, "you'll have to finish it. Every last lick." Romeo blinked in confusion. That didn't sound like punishment. In fact, it sounded like a dream come true. He grinned, unwrapped the candy, and popped it into his mouth without a second thought. But a few minutes later, that grin began to fade. The sweetness that had seemed endless now clung to his tongue, heavy and sticky. His jaw ached, and the once gleaming candy had become work, slow, tiring work. Felipe watched quietly from his chair, pretending to read again, though he was studying every expression on his grandson's face. It wasn't about the candy anymore. It was about what happened when the fun turned into effort, and what Romeo would do next. Romeo's small hands gripped the stick tightly, his tongue pressing against the stubborn candy, as beads of sweat formed on his forehead. Every lick felt like a mountain climb, every turn of the stick a test of endurance. Felipe leaned back in his chair, a soft smile tugging at his lips. He could see the shift in the boy, the fleeting frustration turning into quiet determination, the first taste of patience settling slowly like sugar dissolving in tea. "This is what I meant," Felipe said gently, breaking the silence. "Sometimes you start something because it looks sweet, but the real joy comes when you see it through." Romeo looked up, sticky fingers trembling, eyes wide with both effort and understanding. He nodded slowly, realizing that the lesson wasn't about candy. It was about sticking with what you begin, even when it's harder than you imagined. Felipe's voice carried warmth, laughter, and a whisper of pride all at once. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, echoing the rhythm of Romeo's struggle inside. The world felt still, as if it had paused to watch this small but powerful moment unfold. Romeo's tongue was red, his jaw tired, but there was a spark in his eyes, the spark of discovery, of learning, and of savoring something fully. Felipe knew this was only the beginning. The journey of patience, of finishing what you start, was just starting to unfold. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the kitchen, casting a golden glow over the little table where Romeo sat, lollipop in hand, determination written all over his small face. Felipe poured 2 mugs of cocoa, the rich scent filling the room, and settled across from him, watching quietly. "See?" he said softly. "Sometimes life hands you something sweet, and it's easy to start. But the real magic, the part that sticks, comes when you don't give up halfway." Romeo's jaw tightened around the stick, his tongue working diligently, each turn a small battle against impatience. It wasn't easy. Romeo's cheeks flushed, sticky sweat dotting his temples. But there was something growing in him, a quiet pride he hadn't expected. Felipe noticed every flicker of emotion, the way Romeo's eyes shifted between determination and surprise at his own endurance. "It's funny," Felipe murmured, "how a little candy can teach a big lesson." The boy glanced up, eyebrows raised, realizing for the first time that sweetness wasn't just sugar on a stick. It was effort, patience, and savoring every small moment. Around them, the kitchen hummed with life, the faint ticking of the old clock, the smell of cocoa and sugar mingling, the soft creak of the floorboards as Philippe stretched his legs. The moment felt suspended, sacred in its simplicity. Romeo's world had narrowed to this single task, and in that narrowing, clarity emerged. Finishing something wasn't just about completion, it was about truly appreciating what you'd been given. And as Felipe watched, A subtle smile tugged at his lips, knowing this was one of those rare lessons that would stick long after the lollipop was gone. Romeo's tongue was sticky, and his small fingers ached from gripping the lollipop, but he kept going, slowly turning it, savoring each bite. Felipe leaned closer, his voice calm, guiding but never pushing. "Sometimes we start things because they look fun or easy," he said. "But if you quit halfway, you never get the part that makes it worth it." Romeo chewed thoughtfully, the words sinking in like cocoa melting on the tongue, understanding at last that patience wasn't just a word, it was an experience. The boy's eyes flickered with pride, mixed with exhaustion. Each lick became deliberate, mindful, and somehow magical. Felipe watched, heart full, remembering moments from his own life where he'd left things unfinished. Projects, promises, fleeting joys. Now, seeing Romu push through, he realized that this small, sticky task was shaping a deeper understanding, teaching without scolding, showing that the sweetness of life wasn't just in beginnings, but in perseverance. Around them, the afternoon shadows lengthened, softening the edges of the kitchen. The quiet moments stretched, almost holding their breath, as Romeo tackled the final inches of candy. Felipe's eyes twinkled with silent encouragement, knowing that what seemed like a simple act was becoming a profound lesson in patience, endurance, and the joy of finishing what you start. The lollipop was more than candy now. It was a bridge to understanding, and Romeo was crossing it with every determined lick. Finally, the lollipop dwindled to its last swirl of color, and Romeo's tongue and fingers were red and sticky, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes that Felipe had never seen before. The boy leaned back, chest rising and falling with relief, and for a moment, the kitchen was still, a sacred pause, like the calm after a small storm. Felipe reached over and ruffled his hair, smiling warmly. "See," he said softly, "the sweetness at the end is worth the patience you put in." Romeo grinned, exhausted, but triumphant, realizing that finishing something brought more satisfaction than the quick thrill of starting. Felipe leaned back in his chair, feeling a quiet joy swell in his chest. This wasn't just about candy or lessons. It was about connection, understanding, and growing together. Each sticky finger and red-stained tongue had become a symbol of a deeper truth, that perseverance, even in small moments, leaves a sweetness that lingers far beyond the task itself. The sun dipped lower outside, painting the kitchen in shades of amber and rose. Felipe and Romeo sat together, savoring the calm, a gentle bond woven tighter than before. The jar still glimmered on the shelf, now partially empty, a silent witness to the lesson. Felipe knew this moment would stay with both of them, a memory of patience, love, and the quiet pride that comes from seeing something through to the end. And though the chapter was ending, he sensed that the lessons of the candy jar were only beginning to ripple into the days ahead. Weeks had passed, and the candy jar sat on the shelf, nearly empty now. The kitchen smelled faintly of sugar and lemon polish, a quiet reminder of the afternoons that had passed. Romeo no longer dashed for the jar at every chance, no longer abandoned half-eaten sticks on the table or in the garden. He had learned something subtle but profound, that savoring what you start makes the moment, and the memory, far richer. Felipe watched him from the doorway, a small, satisfied smile tugging at his lips. Romeo's eyes now held a new kind of focus, a patient determination that hadn't been there before. Each time he reached for a lollipop, it was with intention, a quiet reverence for the process. And when he finished it completely, he looked up at Felipe with pride and gratitude, as if sharing an unspoken promise that he would remember this lesson beyond the sweetness of candy. The grandfather felt a deep warmth in his chest, a pride that had nothing to do with teaching and everything to do with love. The sun slanted through the kitchen windows, casting long golden lines across the floorboards. Felipe leaned back in his chair, thinking about how small gestures can carry big lessons. The empty spaces in the jar no longer felt like loss, but as quiet proof that growth had taken place. Romeo hummed softly while tidying the wrappers, a small, everyday act made meaningful by habit and care. And in that moment, the jar, once a source of mischief, became a symbol of patience, completion, and the sweetness of seeing something through. Romeo moved through the kitchen with a calm confidence that was new, almost grown up. The sticky fingers and hurried licks of the past had been replaced with careful attention, a quiet savoring of each sweet bite. Felipe noticed the change not just in the boy's actions, but in his demeanor, a subtle patience, a soft pride shining in his eyes. It was as if each completed lollipop had quietly built something inside him, a little reservoir of understanding about effort, reward, and the quiet power of persistence. The jar, now sparsely populated, gleamed in the late afternoon light like a tiny monument to lessons learned. Felipe ran his hand along the smooth glass, feeling a mixture of nostalgia and quiet triumph. He thought of all the times he had let Romeo steal, all the little smiles and stolen glances, and realized that these small moments were far more valuable than any lecture. Life's sweetest lessons often arrived in sticky, colorful packages, demanding patience and presence to truly be understood. Outside, the garden buzzed softly with the sounds of summer, birds, leaves rustling, the distant laughter of children from the street. Inside, the warmth of the kitchen mirrored that gentle rhythm, a quiet heartbeat connecting grandfather and grandson. Philippe caught Romeo's gaze as he finished his last lollipop of the day, and in that shared look, there was a silent acknowledgement. Lessons had been learned, bonds strengthened, and the simple act of finishing something sweet had opened a window into understanding, patience, and love. The days passed, and eventually, the jar sat completely empty. Not a single lollipop remained, yet the kitchen felt fuller than ever. Romeo had learned to take only what he could finish, savoring each moment and bite with care. Felipe watched him quietly, heart swelling with pride and nostalgia, realizing that sometimes the sweetest lessons arrive wrapped in ordinary things. A glass jar, a simple candy, a few shared afternoons. Years later, when Romeo had grown and life carried him far from that small kitchen, he would still remember those sticky fingers, that stubborn candy, and the gentle guidance of his grandfather. The lesson lingered: patience, persistence, and the quiet joy of seeing something through to the end. And in that memory, the sweetness wasn't just in candy, it was in love, attention, and the small, persistent acts that shape who we become. Felipe's voice would echo in his mind, soft but firm. Grandpa taught me that life's sweetest things deserve patience, and that finishing what you start makes the world taste better. The jar was empty, yes, but the lessons it held were overflowing, and in that overflowing, both boy and man found a taste of life's most enduring sweetness.